I'm very much looking forward to the next panel, which is called Linking the Sessions. As you may remember, the organization of the conference, the organizational idea was to explore several potential game changers for structural transformation and employment in Africa, and go through these 8 specialist sessions. And now we have a panel of eminent persons here who basically take a bird's eye perspective. They have been listening to not the 8, but at least 4 of the 8 sessions. And to really put these things into perspective and say, relatively, which is the more important one? How important will industrialization be? Will the development be more export-led or African market-led, etc.? So the big questions that link the various sessions together. Do we see a potential for the 25 million jobs to be created that we would need? And I see many positive signs within Africa-driven developments. African free trade, urbanization, better educated people, rising incomes in the cities, consumer goods, construction industries, all these things, and renewable energy, access to energy in rural people, all things that drive productivity up, and they will probably mean that we have a certain level of growth potential of 3, 4, 5, 6% in the region. But what I don't see after all these sessions is the big export-driven development as we have seen it in Asia. We should take this now as a starting point for the panel discussion. And maybe may I ask you all to come here up to the stage.
Tillman started out by asking, how do we create large-scale formal sector jobs? You mentioned 20 million a year. You also mentioned that there are about 360 or so million who are already considered workers that we need to move into more decent formal sector jobs. So I was listening to each presentation, I was looking to hear, okay, this is what I'm pushing, and I think what I'm doing here is going to create the large scale number of jobs that we're going to see. The one that came close to that, in my view, has been the work presented by John Page on industries without smokestacks. So what the industry without smokestacks project is providing, and John mentioned 3 guiding criteria. If we disagree with industry without smokestack and you want to go another route, he put out 3 criteria that are general. Check the box of whether it's a sector that is tradable, because tradability is what's going to allow you to scale up and sell beyond the consumption capacity of your limited size of your economy, which in Africa, many of them are small scale. Number 2, check the box of whether it's a sector that benefits from technological transfers. And this is important, because you want productivity in the sector to continue rising along with global trends. Which says higher productivity will also mean higher wages. Third, and critically for Africa, we need to check the box that it can employ large number of moderately skilled labor. And the word moderate was emphasized, so let me re-emphasize. Because for structural transformation, you want your massive labor that is gravitating out of agriculture to be able to seamlessly transition into that sector with some minimal training. So the industry without smokestacks work, then the book is displayed over there. I found agro-processing to be one of them, and I think this would resonate with one of Carlos's endorsements. And it's pushing for tourism. It's pushing also for certain ICT-based services, and we've heard some of them mentioned here yesterday. And then to transit trade, among others. But there could also be other sectors, horticulture, that the project hasn't yet discovered.
Thank you very much. This is really interesting. Unfortunately, we don't have UNIDO here on the panel. I think they will probably not like your messages entirely, because they're very much pro-manufacturing. But I think this is the debate that we really need. I would suggest that we continue with the champion of agricultural development, Joachim von Braun, and then probably move over here to those who will probably then kind of maybe favor a bit, challenge a bit the pro-smoke stacks or pro-agricultural takes. I hope so. Let's see whether we can have a little bit of disagreement also on the panel. And please also, if you want, the conference suffers a bit from treating, although everybody says that Africa is heterogeneous, etc. We keep saying sub-Saharan Africa, and if you in your presentation want to move into differentiate between country groups, etc., I think that will also be very helpful. Joachim, please.
I think we had excellent discussions at this workshop, and in particular also in the cluster on food, agriculture, bioeconomy, and so on. I think my three favorite job machines in Africa are the cluster of agriculture, food processing, modernizing the bioeconomy. Secondly, the energy transformation. The third, the digital IT transformations, which will penetrate the economy. By the way, I feel that any simplistic structuring of the economy by the sectors of agriculture, of industry, and of services have become obsolete. Let me explain. We shouldn't really frame our thinking along these lines of the old sector thinking. Let me explain, for instance, for the case of food and agriculture. We have a fast integration of industrial change related to food and non-food goods. We have fast penetration of services around food distribution systems and value chains. So I would warn us to pick winners using the old terminology of economic sectors. What does make sense, however, is to look in a disaggregated way at manufacturing and at issues related to industrialization in that sense. Let me add a word of caution about the power of these job machines for reaching out to embrace at least a big share of the 25 million, which are the elephant in the room to be tackled. I'm skeptical there. As Brahima already mentioned, the employment elasticities of growth have become rather small. By the way, also the trade elasticities of growth have become small, at least internationally, about half of what they used to be a decade ago. So I suggest we need to combine the innovation and entrepreneurship enhancing policies with a lot of optimism on technological innovations. We need to combine all that, what we have extensively discussed here, with what we have not discussed extensively, that is active labor market policy. There was a lot of reference to China. China had, in its early take-off, very active labor market policies, spending about 10 billion a year on rural public works programs. They are out of that after a couple of decades. These types of active labor market policies have their shortcomings. But colleagues were also discussing an ethical issue here. A society which doesn't provide jobs to its people has a problem. There's an intrinsic value of jobs and an intrinsic value of joblessness. And so this ethical issue has to be addressed by public policies of two types, in my opinion. One is vocational education and training, getting the boys and girls off the street and into meaningful human capital capacity building towards entrepreneurship. And secondly, meaningful public works, investing in rural roads, in the afforestation programs, in the terracing, in the public goods which are labor intensive.
I consider agricultural productivity a major challenge. how we are going to respond to the imperatives of our food systems. Providing food security is extremely important and cannot be underestimated. I certainly believe that the possibilities of industry without smokestacks is there, and it is a reality that we have to cope with, not just because of technological advancements, but also because of the globalization of value chains that has created a completely different dynamics from what we used to have when other regions industrialized before Africa positions itself to do so. So it's about nuances most of the time. But let me continue to emphasize the opportunities that we have for industrial policy, which is more than just manufacturing and even industrialization. It's about how state interventions are done in a strategic way. And by doing it in a strategic way, you kind of have a much more interventionist type of attitude, and I think that is not a nuance. That is a completely different approach. And this is the one I really would like to emphasize. I see three elements that are essential for good transformative policies using industrial policy in Africa. It has to be ambitious, it has to be sophisticated, and it has to be coherent. And I'm going to just qualify each one of them quickly. Ambitious because industrial policies will have to look into a time span that is a bit more longer term. Because the changes are so dramatic, the megatrends that influence our policy environment are particularly acute on demographics, climate, and technology. The second element, the sophistication, it's about priority setting. It's about focus. You cannot enter on everything, so you have to be extremely sophisticated in choosing the areas that are going to be prioritized, and in so doing, well, let's say it's about sectors, it's vertical, it can also be horizontal. But whatever you do, it has to be the result of a very detailed knowledge and policy learning. And finally, coherence. It's about alignment of policies. And policy alignment is a major deficit in most governance structures in Africa. So when we say ODA, 50 billion a year, more or less, and so on, it's not really increasing, it's more or less stable. But the economies are growing, the concessional funding is limited. So, and then you say, where is the money going to come from? Well, it has to come from Africa. But it's only going to come if we really have a much more sophisticated governance. And that, I think, is really the nut that we need to crack. And if we do, then these three ingredients I just mentioned will make sense.
Thank you for advertising our follow-up conference. Stefan, please.
Okay. Look, I want to start by actually saying, we were encouraged to talk about sub-Saharan Africa. We're saying, oh, we know there's a difference. Let's call them out. If I were to make a bet, it's probably going to be about, out of the 43 sub-Saharan African countries, by 2040, about 10 or so that really will surprise us in a positive way. And there will be 10 pretty much basket cases that seem to be mismanaging it. And let me name a couple of them that I put in my bet, and then you can think as well. Thank you for naming one already. But there is a chance, I would say, like in Ethiopia, Kenya, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal, that actually will get into some process of sustainable growth and doing quite well. And there will be, DRC, Malawi, Madagascar, Zambia possibly. Okay, I'm very sorry, Nigeria, we put there these days. That may just not be there. Okay, so that heterogeneity, and I want to actually briefly, in the 2-3 minutes I have to actually say, well, what will be the factors that will make the difference between these countries? Because, we need to think about growth, and growth is a process of, continuing productivity growth. This is not once and for all change. It's not adding some income to a rural household and then say that's it. But it's a cycle of progress that's a virtuous cycle upwards. And so, what kind of areas would you expect it? Well, I would say probably to be successful in growth, you want to be able to make progress in those activities that have a productivity ladder. where you can step on the step and then go to the next step and the next step and the next step. So there's lots of cul-de-sacs in growth where you can make a big gain, but then it's over, okay? So, you know, high yield variety for cassava, at some point it will stop, okay? There's not really a virtuous cycle going on. So it's productivity ladders, and I would add to that, because it's very important to something to do with scale, is managerial and industrial capabilities that get built up, okay? So then automatically we come often to areas, to goods and commodities that are tradable, for the simple reason, because you have processes there that make you be alert to actually climb that ladder, otherwise you'll stay behind. So exports is a big thing, and maybe we haven't talked enough about exports at this event. And so I would say it's these things. So look, in that spirit, if Ethiopia breaks into light manufacturing, great, it can do it. It's going to be tough, but you know, it has a chance, and I wish them enormous luck to do it. As others have said, not everybody's going to do it because, you know, fallacy of competition, and as Ethiopia discovers, it's bloody hard to do so. I mean, it's really hard, and it costs you a huge amount of resources. And the only way it's profitable for Ethiopia is because it puts itself on a productivity ladder, not because it's going to get directly a return from it. You know, these industrial parks are incredibly expensive to the treasury there in Ethiopia. But then you have to be a bit more open-minded and actually say, well, maybe in the current world, our traditional definitions of national accounts are not helping us. Manufacturing, an awful lot of just people putting a nail on a piece of wood is called manufacturing, while someone in a very sophisticated way doing agriculture is certainly not. It's not certainly not something that we should praise. So you want to look across things, those activities where there's productivity ladders. So there will be things like agro-processing in certain ways, not just milling, but going further. There will be something to do, and I'm a big fan of looking forward to thinking about, well, actually, service itself, which we used to think about as just haircuts. You know, I was told national accounts and say, oh, that's the haircuts of the economy. Not tradable per definition. Look, services, you have countries in the world that export more services than anything else. Or India and the Philippines are now, and I'm not talking about remittances, but are exporting IT-enabled services more than anything else. And we shouldn't forget that India is one of these countries we say, and I was yesterday talking about, it's actually a success story. It's not done it by light manufacturing, but it's done it also in having these things. So you look for those areas where you have this productivity ladder. So now, one thing, and I need to disagree with John and a little bit here with the conversation that we were having as well on, you know, not everything without a smokestack is going to be then a good thing. You know, you have to be very careful in what we choose, and maybe that's implied, but sometimes the language gets a bit lost. And it felt sometimes that, and John, you come after me, you can argue back at it, it felt a little bit like anything goes. You know, there are certain things that you will still have to go into it. So let me add two further quick points. So it's about the how and what it means for jobs. Okay, and the how is a bit like, look, there's no doubt that Africa will need, if it wants to succeed in countries finding these bits where there's productivity ladders and learn about these industrial managerial capabilities, it will have to use FDI. FDI is a very good way of transferring some of these capabilities into your economy. Yes, you have to handle this very well, but come, we've learned a lot in the world of how to do this. Secondly, stop being romantic about entrepreneurship. You know, all these medium-sized enterprises, or small-scale enterprise actually, you know, only in IT have we ever identified an individual who's really built up a massive company. Okay, that's the second thing. And the final thing, it's not letting 1,000 flowers bloom. Well, actually, I don't mind as long as they bloom, but if you're going to use some fertilizer for these flowers, select them very carefully. And actually how you do this, you know, like you do, take flowers and actually monitor them carefully, and learn whether it's actually useful to do these fertilizers. So in industrial policy, just be so careful. Now, and there is the rub, there is the problem with this whole thing. I just think that there's a bunch of countries that just do not have the political economy that actually could do this. And that's what I think will make the difference between countries. There's going to be a bunch of them, I talked about yesterday, that have this growth bargain and say, we're going to be willing to learn. Because there's a whole bunch of countries where industrial policy is going to be a recipe for disaster, or indeed we see it, because they will not be willing to learn and very much be quickly captured. And I think that's the big thing.
Thank you. Thank you for sparking a bit of disagreement also on the panel. That's very nice. I think the link, Joachim said in the beginning, employment is something very important for sense of belonging and whatsoever, right? You said in different words. But then, and then you say basically it's the growth story, but at least I think we need to make a big differentiation between things that are likely to have the externalities and things that are not. So I don't know whether green hydrogen mega projects in the desert, for example, would have the kind of spillovers. So I think we need to analytically look kind of, at the end of the day, we want employment, right?
Can I have 20 seconds to that? Because that's really important. If you think of it, there is nothing wrong with getting growth from natural resources. There's something wrong if you have growth from natural resources that you don't use the rents from it sensibly.
John, yesterday when you had the keynote, we had to cut off the discussion. We didn't have time, so now, fortunately, you have another opportunity to present your ideas here. We have been talking about the smokestacks. It's a big kind of different viewpoints on it. I think the key thing is the things should be scalable, they should be tradable, and they should have something like a productivity ladder, right? So there should be knowledge spillovers from that. That's what people have traditionally ascribed to the machine tool industry, to electronics, to those things, which in the Hausmann logic, etc., then lead to spillovers into new sectors. There's knowledge being created that can be used in diversified ways and thereby. And to what extent, which of your smokestacks have these characteristics? So tourism, for example, Serengeti has its limitations, so you can then so many tourists, but then there are limits to it. Which one has a productivity ladder? So maybe from that angle, you can be more specific about the most promising smokestacks that you suggest in your research.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. It's always a dangerous thing to give me the last word. Another round. Okay. So that's be careful with what I say. Just to respond to Stefan, no, not every industry without smokestacks is a good industry without smokestacks. I mean, the whole point is what we're looking for is things that walk and quack and waddle like manufacturing. And that speaks very much to Tillman's point. What are the elements that walk and quack and waddle like manufacturing? It is putting yourself on a productivity ladder, it's scalability, it's the ability to benefit from agglomeration, it's economies of scale. So not every service industry qualifies as an industry without smokestacks. On the other hand, you ask, well, which are some of the more promising ones? And I'm going to give you a surprise. My current favorite is tourism. You would be astonished to learn that not only hotels, which makes some sense, logic, but restaurants are actually learning enterprises. These are people who are capable of increasing their productivity over time. There are fascinating pieces of the literature, largely in specialist journals that no one ever reads, that tell us about the way in which capabilities are mastered in the tourism industry or in the elements of the tourism industry. And as a result, you actually have a productivity enhancing set of enterprises. Similarly, and it's a bit more puzzling, I think, because horticultural crops are subject to such stringent international standards, and because they face such very difficult and demanding buyers, a huge amount of learning takes place in the horticulture sector. Again, kind of something that's quite astonishing is our paradigm, with apologies to Joaquin, of agricultural enterprise is the peasant farmer who's out there with his back bent, doing the same thing that his father and his grandfather did before him. But that's not what a horticultural enterprise looks like at all. So there are subsets of these industries without smokestacks that are quite capable of learning and capable of sort of increasing both in terms of productivity, but also benefiting from economies of scale and benefiting from economies of conglomeration. So that's certainly worth, and again, in some way, transport and logistics are learning enterprises. And in fact, they've been astonishingly changed by changes in technology. What I'd like to come back to a couple of things is, one, to sound a couple of cautionary notes, because so far we've been pretty upbeat about all of this, but I think it's important to also think about what may limit the potential for Africa to achieve the employment that we would hope would take place in the year 2040. And the first one I'm going to put on the table is the global economy itself, both as a consequence of changes in technology, but also as a consequence, and this is an embarrassing thing for an American economist to have to admit, of rogue behavior on the part of people who refuse to play by the rules of the game. And I think the international trading environment is going to become increasingly difficult. Set against that, I think one of the more positive, optimistic aspects of this is the creation of the Africa Free Trade Area, which should then allow an alternative, an African-centric alternative, what to my mind becomes increasing bilateralism in global economic relations. The second one is to pick up another one of Stefan's themes of romanticism. Let's be careful about the romanticism of the African urban middle class. Keep in mind that Africa is urbanizing at a much lower level of per capita income than any other part of the developing world. The result of that, I think, is important because it means that African cities are fiscally constrained, and that as a consequence of that, they tend to sometimes be crowded and disconnected, and unable to fulfill the agglomeration economies that we've associated with urbanization in other settings. So the notion that somehow urbanization will solve the problem, I think, is something we should be quite careful with.
I would like to emphasize something which I'm really missing in this growth debate. The preconditions to facilitate growth need to be invested in. As long as there are about 250 million people undernourished in Africa, we don't have a precondition for growth. We don't have one for entrepreneurship, we don't have one for productive labor engagement. That's, I think, a key area for development aid investment. As long as the health sector is not invested more in, the key precondition is missing. FDI was mentioned. I'm a great believer in knowledge transfer through foreign direct investment. But we recently looked at the FDI the last 15 years in the food sector in Africa. Roughly 3 billion a year. The development aid related to food and agriculture was about 11 billion a year. And the job generation, the direct and indirect job generation, generously calculated from FDI in food and agriculture, is minimal. I think we need to find ways to have FDI tilted much more towards sound industrial clustering. If I look at industrial clustering attempts in Ethiopia, which doctoral students of us has worked on, in the shoe manufacturing sector, not much progress. It's largely replacing the 50,000 shoemakers in the sweatshops in downtown Addis Ababa by a couple of factories having 5,000 each manufacturing modern shoes. So we need to get our accounting right. We may miss out on what's happening unaccounted for.
Thank you very much. Before we pass on to Kul, I think one thing that you said in your previous statements, I think resonates very much with my thinking. We don't see the big growth machine creating all these jobs in a productive way. What you mentioned, bypassing, was basically the public works type of thing that would be complements to this kind of growth policies. No? I think this is something that is where we are working on also. using social protection as a precondition for future productive investments, and to not think in the silos of this is industrial policy and the growth people and this social protection, which comes once growth has been created, but then turn this around and really think about how do we create jobs tomorrow for those that cannot be integrated in any kind of productive value chains. I think this is a very important part of the equation, so it shouldn't be lost here. Cool, please.
So I very much share John's guarded optimism about the potential of urbanization to be this driver of economic growth. It is indeed, I think, possible, but we will need to do a deeper study to better understand those unique patterns of Africa's urbanization that is unlike what we've seen in the past. And we have a project in the pipeline doing just that. Results could be shared in due time. One of the key trends that was mentioned, but that I haven't seen much discussed, maybe I'll just focus my time on that, it is the issue of the demographics. I think it was touched on in the opening panel by Vera, and she gave her take on it. And I think the notion, basically, that say Africa is a youth bulge is unprecedented, I think, is not quite factually accurate. If you looked at depending on how you measure it, Asia has gone through the same experience. Youth shares, as a share of work, as the total population peaked in the early 70s at sizes that were bigger than when Africa's sort of reached its own peak. But the key question then is for Africa, how do you manage the demographic transition and ultimately demographic dividend? And is it happening? And what do you need to look for to ensure whether or not it's happening? And importantly, what are some of the preconditions for you to be able to harness it? We have some analysis we've done, and we've highlighted some takeaways in our foresight report. So looking at East Asia, a region that's been mentioned here as having successfully managed its demographic transition and harnessed the dividends, East Asia and Africa have roughly comparable working age share of total population in the mid-60s. But then what you see is from there on, the story diverges. Asia, we see a huge run-up very quickly, and it peaked maybe around 2015, 2010, and then it began to go on a gradual decline. For Africa, in contrast, you see actually it's been flat for quite a while, initially through the 80s, and then began to rise, but very gradually. And it's going to peak in maybe 2065, stay a bit flat, and then begin to come down. So the key ingredients to be able to harness it critically is one, again, to today's conference and the theme, large-scale formal sector job creation. Once you've created those jobs, then the working age population actually is working and is doing decent work that allows them to save. And when they save, national saving rates move up, and that in turn supports investment, and you can ignite a vicious circle of structural transformation. Second criteria, invest in human capital. That human capital is important to keep workers very productive and for them to be able to earn those higher wages and being able to save.
Could you pass on the microphone to Carlos, please, for yet another encouraging final comment, I think.
Actually, I'm going to start on a less positive note. Listening to John and to Stefan about the difficulties of implementing transformative policies, industrial policy in particular, I just want to confirm that my personal view is that this is just for a few. Most countries are not going to be able to do it because it's very complex, it's very difficult. But what I'm encouraged with is the fact that it is central in the debate right now, which means that the odds are in favor of more countries moving in that direction, and transformers are increasing by the day in Africa, but obviously I don't have the illusion that this is now widespread and it's going to be easy. Not at all. It's tough. Those three conditions I just mentioned require a level of leadership, commitment, and also a capacity to learn that is not to be found in most African leaders right now and policymakers, but I'm encouraged it's progressing in the right direction. I think there is a major point to be made about assessing demographic megatrends in the world right now. I believe that the youthness of Africa is a global public good because the aging of the population in other regions of the world is not sufficiently emphasized, and is going to be a major dimension of how the economic structures are going to react, even how we are going to absorb technology. I was making the point this morning about even consumer markets are going to be very much influenced by who is eager to actually consume new technologies, and youthness is going to be a factor into it. You know, the population of Japan is going to go down from 110 million to 90 million by the end of the century. The average age of the population is going up in all OECD countries and so on. So these factors have to be assessed simultaneously with the demographic trends in Africa, not in isolation. Because I think it's the first time that you have this demographic transition taking place when there is a significant aging of the population elsewhere. And I don't think this is enough emphasized.
Now, if you explain what to do with the countries that don't have a growth contract, then you will be the keynote speaker of our governance conference.
Thank you for the challenge, and thank you for giving me 2.5 minutes to say that. Now, finally, Ethiopia is, of course, a country, I think they have a development bargain or a growth bargain, and hopefully they can sustain it. Now, how can we actually get in all these basket cases or other cases that actually may not get it? So I would actually want to make very quickly a point here is that, you know, if Jim Robinson was in the room, Robinson and Smokey Robinson would be in the room and say, oh, well, you know, you need someone to see the light, you know, somewhere Lee Kuan Yew will come along and reincarnation into Paul Kagame and suddenly everything is fine. You know, the idea of that suddenly there will be the leader that suddenly takes it, I don't think that's the nature of most elite bargains in most societies. Some others would say, oh, you need a big event, a traumatic event, and people would point to Vietnam or Bangladesh or big traumatic events, maybe Ethiopia or Rwanda as well. No, you don't necessarily have that. I think we should not forget that if we go back in our societies back to the 19th century, we were patrimonial societies. We were societies where what we saw in the formal institution developing, you had all these informal networks that basically were grabbing all the rents and controlling and doing all the things. We were not very different at the time. I mean, it's not for nothing that Weber used the term patrimonial states to describe states in Europe. And so that you actually should not forget. We should think of how that actually changed. I don't know, I'm not the expert on the history there, but what we saw definitely is that in some societies, certain bits started getting better, pockets of excellence developing. I know that's controversial, but you found bits and pieces that were making progress, and maybe these are things we can invest in. In any case, the main thing that we need to get, and I think that's how it changed in our societies, is at some point, these elites started noticing that there is more money to be made from actually capturing rents from growth than actually capturing rents from redistribution. And that actually is the main thing. In the end, can you find a way, including through external forces, to get somehow the incentive shifted gradually towards that actually accumulation is a better idea than just redistribution between the elites. And I think that actually in the end is how societies change.
I think this is also why we have this twin conference idea to have firstly, because some sectors, some activities are clearly more prone to rent seeking and rent distribution than kind of promising this kind of a growing cake, which at the end of the day benefits everyone. And the smokestacks are probably more positive in that regard than oil. So you wanted to find a word, you have it.
Thank you, gentlemen. Listening to Carlos talk about sub-Saharan Africa reminded me of my first days as the chief economist for Africa in the World Bank, and my first boss was Callisto Madavo. And Callisto, invariably, when I would start pontificating about sub-Saharan Africa, would shake his head at me and go, John, Africa is not a country. My point is, I want to end on an optimistic note, that just as Africa is not a country, my sense is that there will be no single African model of a successful economy. There will be no African tiger, where you can say, well, all these guys, as Justin basically told us, all these guys basically looked all the same. They were all doing the same thing. I think it's going to be a much more subtle variation across countries. Many of them will succeed. Some of them will certainly fail, and that I would agree with Stefan on. But you'll find some countries that actually manage to solve the problem of how to manage natural resources in a way that contributes to economic growth. I mean, it turns out, at least I always sort of, in my gut, feel like this is not rocket science. Eventually, better governance, and maybe this then segues into the next panel, will ultimately result in people making the proper decisions as to how you manage natural resources for growth, and how you manage them for the diversification of the economy when you know the natural resources are going to run out. I think there will be some mixed economies that are manufacturing economies, but also have a subset of industries without smokestacks. It's not inconceivable, for example, that Kenya could be a mixed manufacturing tourism economy. And there will be some economies that are more broadly mixed, in which the non-traded sector, the services sector, begins to play a more dominant role, and it goes through a transition which is, we might call it a more modest structural transformation than the abrupt structural transformations we were used to in Asia, but nevertheless is effective in terms of raising incomes and providing employment. So I think that would be my concluding message, is that there will be no African tiger. Just as Stefan pointed out to us, there are no tigers in Africa. But there will be African successes. And I think on that note, probably I should end my talk.
Thank you much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. No tigers, but a zoo. That's what I said. Thank you very much. I think it was an excellent panel.